I'm going to start with former president of Southwestern Seminary, Ken Hemphill, who, responding to the law amendment and others like it, recently lamented at the website, The Baptist Review. He says, "In recent years, it appears to me that we, the SBC, are slowly but surely embracing a top-down hierarchical model. Our ecclesiology is moving away from our historic congregational model to a more of a presbyterial or even episcopal model. And he would prefer that we not, quote, tell local churches what titles are appropriate for anyone on their staff," end quote. A theology professor, Malcolm Yarnell, who's a friend, said something similar on Twitter last November. He says, quote, "If Southern Baptists make the final transition into treating the Baptist faith and message as necessary for all member churches, we will have taken a significant step into a constrictive Presbyterian view of confessions and a significant step away from historic Baptist freedoms." Are Doctors Hemphill and Yarnell correct? Now, over the last year, I've been serving on what's called the Cooperation, SBC Cooperation Committee, together with Travis Kerns, who's going to be on the panel with us in a moment. And we were a one-year study group tasked with considering what does it mean to be an SBC church. The SBC, I trust most of you know this, but for the couple who don't, you have the Constitution, and then you have the Baptist Faith and Message, our confession. The Constitution, how we conduct our business, and then you have the Baptist Faith and Message. And it's a Constitution which specifies what is a church's relationship to the Baptist Faith and Message, what must it be? And it requires, the Constitution requires that a church's faith and practice must closely identify with the convention's adopted statement of faith, the Baptist Faith and Message. And our committee of 20 sought to understand what this means, and we'll present our recommendations from the front stage tomorrow night. And both on this committee and throughout the year, I've heard a number of people express again and again their concern over whether or not the SBC is moving away from a freely associating autonomous church convention model, churches convening together to work together, and replacing that with a top-down, again, denominational model, as they've called it. Again, what are we to make of this? Now, I did send this talk to both Drs. Yarnell and Hemphill ahead of time, and I got their responses, and maybe on the panel I'll show you the responses. In 1846, pastor theologian J.L. Reynolds declared, "Church polity has become the absorbing topic of the Christian world." Boy, what days those must have been. Not much to do in the evenings of 1846. Well, for one short evening, let us absorb ourselves, shall we, in the topic of church polity. Now, I don't assume everybody, even on the panel, is for the law amendment, but the law amendment does give us the opportunity to discuss some of these polity matters that make us Baptists, as opposed to Presbyterians or Anglicans. You all are members, I trust, of Baptist churches. Do you know why and what distinguishes you from those other kinds of churches? I'm going to start with a few comments on why one might be tempted to sympathize with Hemphill and Yarnell, and then offer a few reasons for why that's not worth sympathizing with. And let me just say about Dr. Yarnell, I'm basing what I'm saying on one tweet. I get frustrated when people represent me from one tweet. Okay, so I want to treat him charitably. I'm just responding to a tweet. That's all. All right? Why sympathetic? Well, here's why one might be sympathetic with what they are saying. The SBC has never required full subscription, as in subscribing to, the Baptist Faith and Message for churches to seat messengers. And when the SBC was formed in 1845, it did not adopt a confession of faith. Why? Well, first, says Nathan Finn in an article that technically has my name on it, but he wrote it, the convention was, quote, not intended to be a denomination with perpetual membership. And second, says Nathan and me, a confession was unnecessary because Baptist churches enjoyed significant doctrinal consensus. Parentheses, it might be worth considering whether or not we enjoy such consensus now. Now, Southern Seminary adopted the Abstract of Principles in 1859, but this did not apply to churches. The convention as a whole did not adopt a confession of faith until the 1925 Baptist Faith and Message, but the 1925 Baptist Faith and Message did not bind entities or churches. Instead, the preamble said that the articles, quote, constitute a consensus of opinion of some Baptist body, large or small, for the general instruction and guidance of our own people. General instruction and guidance. Not subscription, like we all believe this, but it's general instruction and guidance. That's what the 1925 Baptist Faith and Message said, as well as the 1963 Baptist Faith and Message. It repeated that same language. Interestingly, it wasn't until 1992 for the first time an amendment was added to the SBC Constitution declaring progressive views on sexuality out of bounds for SBC churches. Now, by the mid-1990s, Southern Seminary and Southeastern Seminary began to require faculty to subscribe to the Abstract of Principles. The Baptist Faith and Message, as you mostly know, was revised again in 2000, but still churches did not have to declare themselves to be fully subscribed to it. Then in 2014, the convention adopted a revision to Article 3 of the Constitution saying about the Baptist Faith and Message that, again, the faith and practice of a church must closely identify with the Baptist Faith and Message. And the ambiguity of that statement is one reason Finn suggests that we had this cooperation committee, and shortly thereafter further amendments were added on racism and abuse. Okay, that's the history, as quickly as I can tell it, of what churches must do with regard to the Baptist Faith and Message. Now, interestingly, the SBC is not the only group of churches with a constitutional provision calling for something slightly ambiguous like closely identifies with. I'm going to go a little bit more into the weeds here, okay? The Presbyterian Church of America, the PCA, also does. Now, the Westminster Standards, which is like all of their documents, which churches have to agree with, it requires churches and elders to subscribe to entirely the Westminster Confession of Faith, and the larger and the shorter catechism. But then the Westminster Standards also include something called the Directory of Worship. And with regard to the Directory of Worship, the PCA's Book of Church Order, their constitution, states the Directory for Worship is an approved guide and should be taken seriously as the mind of the church agreeable to the standards. However, it does not have force of law and is not to be considered obligatory in all its parts. Note, the language is similar to the 1925 and 1963 Baptist Faith and Message with regard to Directory of Worship, not to their confession, but their Directory of Worship. It's a guide, not obligatory in all its parts. That said, by a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly, which is going on this week, as Mark said, they can constitutionalize aspects of the Directory of Worship and say, okay, that part of the Directory of Worship you all have to do, okay, by 2/3 vote. And interestingly, just this week, the PCA General Assembly is considering their version of the Mike Law Amendment. And how they've managed to stay out of the news while we haven't, I'm not sure. They must have better PR people.
They own the newspaper.
They own the newspaper, perhaps. That's the Episcopalians. Pretty sure that's the Episcopalians. Okay, so the Book of Church Order already says elders must be men. Still, in recent years, a number of guest women preachers have shown up in PCA churches. Therefore, the PD Presbytery, which is in South Carolina, has offered Overture 3, we call it the Law Amendment, they call it Overture 3, to the General Assembly, and the Overture 3 clarifies in the directory for worship that only qualified men can preach, and to give that constitutional status. So almost the exact same thing we are considering. So you hear all this and you think maybe Hemphill and Yarnell are correct. Maybe we are becoming more Presbyterian, even as Presbyterian as they are. Aren't we doing the same thing? Okay, reasons for possible sympathy. Now reasons for not. Not even close. The law amendment tightens doctrinal subscription on the doctrine of ordination. Ordination, yes. But it does not move our ecclesiology one iota away from our historic congregational model to a more Presbyterial or even a Presbyterian or Episcopal model. Now I have a slide that should appear on the screens. Let me know, is it up? I can't see. No, yes. Should be coming. Also, you can, if you want to see it on your own phone, you can go to 9marks.link/slide. 9marks.link/slide if you want to take it with you. All right? Now, what this graph describes is the final difference between what I would call a connectional denomination and cooperation. That is, there is a fundamental difference between the kind of authority which makes a church what a church is, and the kind of authority that regulates membership in a group or network or association or convention or even denomination, if you want to call it that, of autonomous, independent, or free churches. So Hemphill mentions the Presbyterian and Anglican models. So that brings us to the left side of your graph there, the connectionalist side. Look at those. In a denomination characterized by connectionalism, a bishop or a presbytery, and for those of you who don't know, a presbytery is a gathering of elders from multiple churches. Okay? Elders multiple get together, and that's the presbytery. They are the ones who possess the authority to make the local church a church, or to do the things that are essential to establishing a church. This is determining doctrine, determining membership, determining who the pastors are. So the PCA's Book of Church Order, for instance, gives the authority to plant and particularize, that's their language, a new church to the presbytery. The presbytery decides, okay, look, we're starting a church here. Anglican Church of North America, ACNA, the bishop possesses that authority. Let's just double click a little bit more. The PCA, a congregation will vote to call a pastor, but that pastor must be approved and ordained by the presbytery. So with the removing of a pastor, the presbytery must approve of that dissolution. In the PCA, the body of elders in a local church called the session has authority to excommunicate members of the church, but if they want to appeal that, do they appeal that to the congregation? No, they appeal that to the presbytery, which is to say the presbytery has final say over who the member of the church is. And if a doctrine is going to change, where does that happen? Well, it happens at the level of the presbytery or the General Assembly. And these overtures and decisions are then binding on churches. So what will happen if Overture 3 from the PD Presbytery passes and then a church ignores it? Well, according to the Book of Church Order, the presbytery has the power, quote, to review the records of church sessions, redress whatever they have done contrary to order, and take effectual care, like we can get it done, we can make it happen, effectual care that they observe the constitution of the church. So if a church persists in having women preach, they can either remove them from the PCA or even dissolve the church. Friends, is anybody in the SBC talking about dissolving churches? No. Thank you. It was a rhetorical question, but that's good. Let's turn to ACNA, Anglican Churches of North America. The bishop possesses the authority to establish a church, as I said. As with the Presbyterian and the PCA, the bishop is the one to ordain and install pastors. He can also defrock, it's their language, a pastor. He's the one with the authority to grant confirmation. So, you're baptized as a baby and at some point you're confirmed. Well, who does that? It's not the senior pastor, the rector. It's the bishop who confirms, has the authority of confirmation, right? Who changes the church's doctrine? Well, a bishop can, within a limited space, within his own diocese, he can decide whether or not to install female pastors in the different churches of the diocese. Larger changes, say, concerning sexuality, have to come from a college of bishops. So again, in a connectionalist denomination like the PCA or ACNA, the denominational structure has church constituting authority. It says what the teaching is, who the members are, who the pastors are. And if you have control over what's taught, or who does the teaching, as well as who the members are, you have control in some measure over the existence of that church. Now, obviously, there's a spectrum here, which is why you see the arrows pointing outward on the left side. In some respects, ACNA churches have more authority than PCA churches, and in some respects, PCA churches have more authority than ACNA churches. Both of them have less authority than, say, a United Methodist church, which can simply impose pastors on congregations. And they have even less authority than, say, the Roman Catholic Church, which would be all the way out. One more crucial piece to understand here. A connectionalist authority isn't merely the authority to establish churches. It's an authority that makes all these churches one church. What do I mean? Well, think about an army. All the corps and divisions and battalions together form one army. What makes them one army? Well, the fact that they are under a centralized command structure. The centralized command structure makes them one army. After all, the centralized command structure can say, let's form a new division or form a battalion. And the existence of each battalion depends upon a centralized command structure. The command structure makes them one army. Makes sense with me? And so it is with a connectionalist denomination. That's why the Roman Catholics refer to the Roman Catholic Church, singular. The United Methodists refer to the United Methodist Church, and the Presbyterians refer to the Presbyterian Church. And they mean it. They mean that whole thing with all the churches and the structures over them are a church. Here's a sentence from the webpage of the ACNA Church, one in my own city. The Anglican Church in North America unites 112,000 Anglicans and nearly 1,000 congregations across the United States, Canada, and Mexico into a single church. So if you look at that crescendo on the left side of the graph, the more authority over constituting elements of making a church, the more they are counted as one church. And as that box below says, it's an authority to establish a church, dissolve a church, add or remove a church, add or remove members, change doctrine. Not all connectionalist congregations can do all of that. It is a spectrum. But what I hope is absolutely clear to everyone in the room, and I wish we're clear among all those discussing these things in the convention, this is not what we are talking about at all in the Southern Baptist Convention. The SBC cannot touch a church, its doctrine, who its members are, who its pastors are, and so forth. They remain utterly and entirely free, independent, autonomous, and nobody wants otherwise. What is the SBC conversation about then? Well, it's entirely about the right side of the graph. It's about cooperation. The principle here is pretty simple. The more you agree upon, the more you can accomplish. So Christians from multiple denominations agree on the basics of the gospel, so they pour their money into campus ministries like Cru or Campus Outreach, simply for the sake of evangelism. Baptist, Anglican, Presbyterian churches agree on that, and they can cooperate for those purposes. Yet Baptist churches, such as the churches of the SBC, agree not only on the gospel, but on what a church is. So we can agree to plant churches together. And if we keep moving outward on that rightward line, we know that certain state and local associations or networks like Pillar require even more levels of agreement, potentially enabling them to do even more together, such as planting churches that adhere to practices like expositional preaching that are not specified in the B, F, and M. Okay, there it is. So what's going on with the law amendment? We're not moving one iota towards connectionalism, as Hemphill and others are suggesting. At most, we're moving one click rightward on the cooperation spectrum. We're seeking to require just a little bit more clarity or certainty in an already articulated agreement. And ironically, even non-Christian journalists understand this. An Associated Press newsletter, which was implicitly complaining about the law amendment, still recognized the distinction between connectionalism and cooperation. It says, quote, "Since Baptist churches are independent, the convention can't tell them what to do or whom to appoint as a pastor," first sentence, "but the convention can decide which churches are in and which are out." There it is, the whole thing in 2 sentences. They're like, Jonathan, you could have saved us some time and just read that. Since Baptist churches are independent, the convention has no authority over them. Still, the convention, like any other club or network association, has a sovereign right to determine its own standards of membership. So if the Treehouse Club wants to say, to be a member, you have to abide by these principles and hop on your left foot every Tuesday, it can do that, but in no way does that infringe upon the independence or autonomy of those who wish to climb into the treehouse. Let me conclude by going back to the question of theological consensus. One might have existed in some of these things in 1845 or 1925, but does one exist today? In some matters, sure. But what about male and female gender roles? In our post-Christian and neo-pagan culture, theological liberalism is entering churches not merely through epistemology, but through ethics. Confessions, written before the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, didn't need to make moral claims because a Christian-ish moral consensus characterized the country. Yet that consensus has been dissolving rapidly in the latter decades of the 20th century, and as Christians felt the fade, they began inserting ethical content into their confessions, as the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 does. In other words, we discovered our need to declare our moral distinctives, both to distinguish ourselves from the world and to equip our churches to best enjoy God's good gifts of maleness and femaleness and marriage properly defined. You can't say you're standing up for orthodoxy if you're not standing at the primary place of attack. And the members of our churches don't feel attacked over or tempted to abandon historic views on God or justification by faith alone in quite the same way they do on gender. And Christians generally, and Southern Baptists specifically, are asking their leaders for instruction, formation, correction, and courage in the places of gender and sexuality. And that is why I think a statement of faith like the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 helps provide. Which is to say, I think now is the time for Southern Baptists to think about not pushing toward connectionalism, wrong conversation, but to strengthen our convictions in a matter of cooperation. With that, let me invite the other panelists to join me on stage. Immediately to my left, Nate Akin, Executive Director of Pillar Network, and a member of what church?
Open Door Baptist Church.
Open Door Baptist
Raleigh,
Church.
North Carolina.
Travis Kerns, who once upon a time taught at Southern and then taught at Southwestern. And with you, I think you guys taught together, correct, Dr. Wills? And now is an association director at the Three Rivers Association. Did I get it right this time? In South Carolina.
Yep.
Dr. Greg Wills, professor at Southern Seminary. What church you at? LaGrange.
LaGrange Baptist.
You were there before, weren't you? Before you? Okay, I went back. And Mark. So. Hey, Nate wrote this. Convictional, confessional, cheerful Baptists. What's this about?
The title.
Anything you want to say about it?
Yeah, I want to be convictional about what we believe. Confessions help us do that, and we can do that without being jerks.
Excellent. And they can buy this anywhere. Amazon.
We're giving it out tomorrow at the Baptist 21 panel,
Okay.
so you'll get a copy if you're coming to that, and then, yeah, you can get it elsewhere. So.
Fantastic. Okay, guys, I want to first start with any thoughts on what I said, any agreements or disagreements. I can tell you what Hempel and Yarnell said. Should I start there? It's one paragraph email. I finished my talk around 1 p.m. today. I sent it to them, so they didn't get much time. Dr. Yarnell says, first, thank you for doing us the friendly part of sharing your paper before you even present it. You demonstrate in this very act the way forward as brothers seek to embrace and live in Christian truth and dogma and morality. Second, please understand our primary claim is that we detect a movement or trend towards non-Baptist views and hierarchical frames of thought. W.W. Barnes of Southwestern Seminary saw this trend coming a long time ago with his concern about the temptation of presbygationalism. Third, it does not seem germane to place Baptist conversations in the frame of intra-Presbyterian and intra-Anglican arguments, nor to follow their definitions of polity. Fourth, as a historical note, please recognize that Southwestern Seminary affirmed the Baptist faith and message in 1925 and with every major revision. Fifth, we recall the great limits on confession and recognition of the freedoms of individuals and churches stated in the preamble of every BF&M vote by the SBC. Both the preamble and the Constitution are the framework for the confession's understanding and use. Sixth, we are unsure of the source of your definition between cooperation and connectionism. Finally, we are always prepared to exalt Jesus Christ in the power of the Spirit for the glory of God with you. How wonderful. You are free to share this whole response as you see fit. So that is their thoughts. What do you guys think?
Well, on that fifth thing about the source, I assume you thought it up.
I couldn't hear.
Yeah, on the fifth thing that Malcolm said, we failed to find the source. I assume you thought it up. Okay, that's the source. The old noggin of Leeman.
Footnote, me.
Where many a good distinction has arisen.
You guys have thought a lot about Baptist polity. Am I misconstruing, misunderstanding this distinction between connectionism or cooperation? Is that a legitimate distinction? And are we placing PCA and Akin over here rightly and us over here rightly? You affirm, disaffirm, qualify?
I'll speak if nobody else is going to speak. No, I think you were on. My favorite part of it is that the Pillar Network is the mirror opposite of Rome. So that was my favorite part of the whole.
And local associations.
And local associations, sorry. We turned out pretty good in this, yeah. No, I mean, part of the thing that bothered me in the conversations last year leading up is that we didn't get to tell Saddleback that they couldn't have, that they weren't a church, nor that they couldn't continue to have a female act as a pastor. So we didn't have the same authority that the PCA or the others that you mentioned. And so, yeah, I think the things that you shared were helpful in drawing those distinctions. I've grown real tired of the kind of this violates local autonomy, which has been one of the main things I've heard. We're not violating their local autonomy. We're not saying they're not a church. We're not saying they can't order their church in the way that they would see fit and right. What we are saying is that you can't order your church in this way and be in friendly cooperation with us. And that's two different things.
Right. You three brothers, and this is going to be 15 seconds. You can say fine or nothing.
I find it interesting that the local autonomy of the church is brought up with this particular discussion, but to my knowledge was not raised when homosexuality was added to the Constitution, when abuse was added, when ethnic discrimination was added. This has some type of qualitative difference that's causing this discussion to be raised now rather than over the past three theological, though they have ethical implications, they are still theological issues, biblical issues that were added to the Constitution that are both covered by Scripture and the Baptist faith and message.
Now, before I went to seminary, I was a journalist and thought myself a pretty good writer. Then I took classes from Dr. Wills. And all the red ink on my paper, I'm just like, huh? So give us some red ink.
I think this is a pretty simple issue. And the plea of autonomy is a red herring at best. It's a very simple matter that the churches are fully independent and autonomous. And the convention and associations have an inalienable right, as you said, to determine the qualifications for admission and to curate the fellowship with regard to any church or organization that strays from those qualifications.
Okay. Anything to add?
I think the distinctions you've drawn are accurate historically and theologically. I also think the conversation we're taking place is vitally understood by the context that we're in. We are in an all-out war on gender. And so while if it were 35 years ago, I might think, I don't know, we need to do this. Right now, yeah, this is part of that larger war. And I'm sorry if some brothers don't see it that way. That doesn't make me diminish my love and appreciation for them. But to me, as a pastor of a local church, it's clear this is part of that.
And I think tomorrow night we're going to pick up that complementarian conversation a little bit more. But that's a useful prelude. Dr. Wills, any further thoughts on the history of subscription in the SBC? Because I admit when I started this conversation, it took me a while to get my head around, oh my goodness, wait, we haven't required churches to affirm that up until like recently? Is that basically the summary? And in the last few decades, we are starting to require more. But that's not the history of the SBC.
No, your history was accurate. There was no, as you said, no confession of faith until 1925, but even in 1925, there was no requirement of subscription. It's not until 1992. As best I can tell, we did not expel a single church, and actually you can't expel a church from the SBC because churches don't join the SBC. Right. I mean, where do you go to hand in an application? You don't apply. There's no membership. And so what they deny is the right to...
Explain, what do you mean there's no membership? Because I assume most people, as I did, thought, well, no, of course we're members. Just unpack that part a little bit.
No, you have a right to participate in the annual meeting based upon your contributions and your, under our current Constitution,
to seat a messenger.
And your declared desire to be a church in harmony and cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention. And that constitutes your right then to seat messengers at the Southern Baptist Convention.
So not membership, but seating messengers.
Yeah.
So Greg, when the executive committee refers to how many Southern Baptist churches there are in the District of Columbia, what are they doing?
Those are the churches that have a right to seat messengers. They send contributions. They intend to be in cooperation and harmony with the Southern Baptist Convention. And
so there is a list of such churches being kept.
Oh, sure. This churches that can. I assume there's a list. I don't know that for a fact, but I assume there is. And even if the executive committee doesn't have it, I'm sure Lifeway does. But it's a list of churches that have a right to seat messengers. And we don't perhaps even necessarily have to have that list because it's only an issue if someone challenges the credentials of any messenger. Historically, anyway, that's how it comes up.
Travis?
So the list that the exec committee supposedly has, we discovered in the cooperation
group. Keep that right up to your mouth.
Yeah, in the cooperation group, we discovered that this list, supposedly held by the executive committee, is not actually held by the executive committee. So if you go on the SBC website and go to church search, you can search through churches that at some point in the past have given at least $1 to the cooperative program through their state convention or directly to the EC or directly to an entity. But that list is inaccurate at best. So even the Lifeway SBC ID list is incorrect.
So we don't know how many Southern Baptist churches there are.
We really don't.
That's true.
We are like the Pharisees when Jesus confronts them and asks them the question, they say, we don't know. That's kind of what the cooperation group did on that particular point.
You know many of them. I mean, the ones that are active participating, you can be pretty certain of those, but it's the 20, 30, 40% who show up once every 5 years and give money once every 5 years.
It is amazing to me the conservative resurgence worked, even though churches weren't required to subscribe to the BF&M. Any thoughts about that?
Well, one thing that's interesting, it did move people to being more confessional at the national level. Yeah. So it did work. I was reading recently, to reveal my Baptist nerddom, I was reading the Peace Committee recommendations recently, and the Peace Committee, interestingly, said that we need to make every single trustee of our entities affirm the Baptist Faith and Message 1963 in 1987, and they did not go that route. So the fact that y'all now have made that recommendation again shows that even in 86 and 87, when they're having these conversations about the fight in the SBC, they are in that fight because the confession is not as central as it should be, and they're appealing to the confession in order to actually have conversations about the direction they're going to go, because the whole conversation revolves around Article 1 of the Scriptures. And so they are appealing to something in order to make their case, even though it is not governing the kind of who can seat messengers. I think that's starting to reveal to them there needs to be more, not less, subscription in the days ahead. And slowly but surely, we've moved in that direction.
Well, yeah, as the one old enough to have lived through this, that what happened is a strict subscription on inerrancy particularly was enforced informally but regularly by an informal association of pastors who managed to get their guys elected president starting in 1979. And then local church pastors like myself are phoned by a guy who works for new president of the convention saying, hey, we need some trustees who believe in the inerrancy of the Bible and who will enforce this. And then they would want names to go to the Committee on Committees for the Committee on Nominations, and for the Committee on Nominations to come prepared with names for the various trustee positions that were open. So there was an informal insistence on subscription on that issue, which was universally affirmed by the conservative candidates for president of the convention throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s.
But that strict subscription was for service as a trustee or officer on any committees. It was not for shall a church be able to cooperate and give money.
Not at all.
Right, but even more explicitly, what they're saying with Article 1 is that the majority of the messengers believe this about Article 1. So the professors of our institutions need to believe this about Article 1. And so they even the will of the messengers in how they relate to the confession is being considered, even though they're not asking for full subscription.
Yeah, exactly right.
And this goes back to 1856 with Boyce's address dealing with 3 changes in theological education that he gave at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, which interestingly Furman is now long gone from Southern Baptist life. And he argues that trustees needed to hold the institution in trust based on a common confession of faith. So directly, he doesn't argue for trustee subscription. He argues for the trustees to hold the faculty accountable to that confession. But then the foundation of that indirectly is if the trustees don't believe it, they're not going to hold the faculty in accordance with that statement.
Travis, just for some nerddom here, so a very interesting parallel to that in the opposite way is E.J. Carnell's The Glory of a Theological Education when he becomes the president at Fuller, and he rejoices in the fact that their trustees don't have to give account to any churches. They can have real, legitimate, honest academic freedom. And you look at Fuller. I mean, there it is. And they're glorying in that address. It's the exact opposite of Boyce. And you see what's happened in both cases.
Mark, you said the conservative resurgence worked in part because of an informal enforcement on inerrancy among pastors. One of the things we considered on the cooperation committee is whether or not to recommend a standard of non-contradiction. So no, you don't have to adopt the Baptist faith and message as your church's statement of faith, but if anything in your church's faith or practice contradicts anything in the BF&M, then you're out of compliance. You should not be a member or seating church. And obviously the committee did not recommend that. It's not one of the 4 recommendations. But what do you guys think? Informal worked back then. Is theological consensus breaking down? Do we need a stronger standard of subscription, whether non-contradiction or full-on affirmation or something, moving into the next decades?
We clearly decided we did in 1998 and again in 2000 when the convention changed its statement of faith.
You're saying we held a strict subscription?
No. I'm saying that I said there was an informal strict subscription on inerrancy, and then he asked that question, and I'm saying we as a convention did act twice on record in 1998 and 2000 to tighten up the statement itself, not the subscription to it.
Right. And at least at that time, it was largely for the entities and organizations of the SBC, and there was no effort to apply it to the church.
That's right.
But in 2015, there is a move to have some level of subscription when we added closely identifies into the Constitution.
That's right. And so we have, I think, two different models of cooperation in our history. One is an associational model of cooperation in which churches have to apply for membership as churches in an association. They have to present a confession of faith and an ecclesiology. The association appoints a committee to examine it, questions them if they need to, and then votes whether they can come in or not. And then if any of those churches ever stray from that, the association will ask them to repent. And if they don't repent, they will be expelled from the association. And so that is, I think, fairly a pretty strict subscription. Now, most of those associations had fairly short confession of
And
faith.
that practice continues on among Southern Baptist associations even today.
Which one?
I assume a bunch of them, given how many churches get this fellowship.
Mine does.
So the reason some of these churches that we have been dealing with the last few years at the SBC level, part of the reason we're dealing with them is the associations do not deal with them.
Oh, I'm sure it's less common than it was 30 years ago. But I'm saying even 30 years ago, they were doing that very regularly. And today, there's still some that do that.
That's
so
right.
this is not just something from the 19th century.
That's
This
right.
is in living memory in Baptist associations very commonly, different than the convention itself.
That's right. Just the associations have slowly been retreating from that sense of stewardship of the fellowship.
So historically, I would love for you to weigh in on this. So it seems, and I can't remember if Dr. Moeller said this on one of our podcasts. I don't know where I got this from, but basically, early on, they didn't know if the Southern Baptist Convention was going to survive. You found your most close loyalty to your local association then, and that was the level at which you could most easily be removed. Now people find their primary identity and loyalty to the national convention rather than their local association, which is why we're moving to being more like a large, which we are. I'm going to say we're not an association, we're a large association. So we're moving towards it. So is that how you think, like, has there been removal of churches, as you said, at the local association level? Is the reason we're moving towards this sort of polity at the national level is because most people find their primary identity here. And that means if they find their primary identity here, this also needs to be where we primarily kind of fence who comes in cooperation. What would your thoughts be to that?
I think it's an important part of it. Over the entire history of the Southern Baptist Convention, we have slowly been moving away from this missionary convention model with very minimal commitment to Baptist faith and practice. And so when the Southern Baptist Convention started in 1845, any individual or church or association or missionary society that contributed money was invited to representation. It was not a church basis of representation, but a contributor basis of representation. We didn't change that until 1931. We finally made it a church basis of representation in the SBC. And then 1925, the adoption of the Baptist Faith and Message, and then 1992, 2014. We have been slowly moving away from this convention model and toward an association model, but we're stuck in the middle. And I think we just need to decide what we want.
Can you clarify for us some of these associational versus conventional issues? Because these three brothers all know what they're talking about, but help us, because you've been an expert in this area.
Yeah, let me go back for a second to something you mentioned, which is the 2014 edition of Closely Identified. Then I'll go to associations. So that phrase, closely identifies with, was pulled from the preamble of the 1963. And that phrase has become a very squishy kind of pick whatever parts you want, believe that, or if you don't like these parts, don't believe that. It's fascinating. When you look at the preamble to the 63, here's what it says. Baptists emphasize the soul's competency before God, freedom in religion, and the priesthood of the believer. However, this emphasis should not be interpreted to mean that there is an absence of certain definite doctrines that Baptists believe, cherish, and with which they have been and are now closely identified. It is the purpose of this statement of faith and message to set forth certain teachings which we believe. I do not think the authors of that preamble in 1963 meant closely identified to be a squishy statement. I think they meant it to mean this is what we believe. These are the basics. So it's interesting that has been it seems to have shifted.
Travis, what about the in friendly cooperation language? Where did that come from?
That was, do you know when that was added, Dr. Wills? Yeah, it's in Article 3, Section 1
I feel like it's even
of the
older.
SBC Constitution.
I mean, cooperation is very early, but I'm not sure about friendly.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Constitution of the SBC doesn't differentiate between in cooperation with and to be in friendly cooperation with. It uses those two phrases interchangeably. Yeah. So local associations.
In like a minute.
Yeah.
It's almost 10. They're tired.
Yeah, are local associations different than states, different from the national? Yes and no. Local associations, like the National Convention, are free to choose whichever, if any, doctrinal statements to which they require their churches to adhere. Some local associations, like ours, have standing membership. So we have about 100 local churches in the upstate of South Carolina that are full members day to day of our association. Last year, or when I got to the association 2.5 years ago, our statement of faith was the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. Over the process of about 1.5 years, I led us to adopt 6 additional statements so that now our churches subscribe to and fully affirm 7 statements of faith. Baptist Faith and Message 2000, Chicago Statement, Danvers, Nashville, the statement on social justice and the gospel, and then 2 statements we wrote or adopted on the office, title, and function of pastor.
All 100 churches fully affirm
Yes.
those. So the congregations have to vote on them, presumably. And so
Yes.
we affirm all of those.
And if we find one in faith or practice out of step from one of those 7, then the membership team, Donald Thomas was here somewhere. I saw him. He's, where are you, Donald? Right back here. He's one of the elders at Abner Creek Baptist in Greer, member of our association. He's the head of our membership team. So if we have a church we find out of step with one of those 7, Donald and I would contact the leaders there.
So
have a
every
discussion.
church is close communion.
No, they're close.
So you have no open
close.
you have no open communion churches in your association.
We do.
And so why aren't they moving out of membership?
So that would be just like with the national level. It's not my role to go and tell them you need to do this.
So it's not strict subscription.
It is, but the process.
Sounds like real life. I mean, yeah.
The process, like the national level, would take somebody at a church to bring that church up under inquiry with the membership team. That has not happened yet. But the steps are there and available for the membership team to use it if it's raised.
Right. So my concern with our language about strict subscription or non-contradiction is that it's not realistic in much of our conversation of it. And when we start asking about the particulars, particular churches, particular issues, then suddenly there are many exceptions. And then my question is, well, is that really strict subscription? Even the PCA doesn't have strict subscription. Even on the Westminster Standards, they allow exceptions as long as it does not threaten any what they consider to be fundamental doctrines.
But Greg, they're allowing exceptions, like on the 4th commandment. That's the typical one that's taken.
4th commandment, 6-day creation.
Yeah. Pope is the Antichrist, man of sin.
Right.
Yeah, but those exceptions don't make the Westminster Standards useless for our Presbyterian brethren. They may rankle us that they're not being as consistent as they could be, but somehow hundreds of them manage to think this is an appropriate level, and they work together and find it quite useful.
It's, as you know, it's quite messy and complicated in the PCA. And they have been struggling for quite some time to know how to deal with this. Right from the very beginning, had 2 different approaches to understanding
Subscription and not.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, I mean, it occurs to me, I could peer into the hearts of the members of the 900 members of your church, Mark, and I could find me here and there with every other member, not every, a number of members, right? But that doesn't mean I'm going to lower the standard of, to be a member of that church, you have to subscribe to the New Hampshire Faith and Message, even hold it consistently, right? In other words, all the arguments that you're making right now, I could apply just to confessions in a church, but we don't do away with confessions in a church.
No, I mean, confessions are, I think, absolutely critical. I don't think we can be faithful either as individual churches or as a group of churches without having strong confessions, without having them playing their appropriate roles. But I think if we think that confessions are going to save our churches, are going to solve many of these problems, I don't think so. And I think in practice, churches
I don't hear anybody saying that, Greg. I mean, I'm in favor of the law amendment, and I don't think for one moment it's going to save this convention. I'm not putting my life into the law amendment. I'm putting my life into sharing the gospel, into building healthy churches. Now, I'm just simply saying that I think the law amendment is a good move for this particular thing. And if some people overhype the way they talk about it, that's on them. But I can be in favor of this as a wise move and not stake my life or our churches on this.
And that's one of the reasons we adopted additional statements of faith, so that one of our associations, and I would argue all associations' purposes, is for the simple reason of watching for other sister churches in the area. If heresy comes up, we have these bookends that we can look at, these particular guardrails we can look at and say, other pastors in the area can go to that pastor, maybe with me or just the pastors by themselves, and say, brother, this is what we agreed on a while back. You agreed to it. Your church agreed to it. What has happened? How have you changed? Let us bring you back to biblical standards. If not, we have a serious problem.
Or, Travis, it might be possible that they would give an answer to you that would satisfy you.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Is adding the law amendment a way of having clarity and not full subscription in your mind? Because so for instance, you're saying not strict subscription, but it's so I used to try to recruit churches to join the Southern Baptist Convention pre-2015. This was the conversation. What does it take to be Southern Baptist? Well, what it takes is for you to give $500 and not affirm homosexuality. That's all it takes. That felt really embarrassing. So I think that's part of why in 2015 there was a move to say we're going to add things in, like you have to actually believe something about our statement of faith and our practice of faith. So it seems to me we're talking about two different things, about whether we're talking about strict subscription and we're talking about the law amendment. Those are two different things. But since we have added things for clarity, like homosexuality and race and sexual abuse, this is and to use Mark's language, this is the issue of the day. This is a place to bring clarity so that we're not actually saying strict subscription, but we are saying it does mean something to be part of who we are. And this is at least one of the boundaries of what that is.
Right. And so I appreciate that very much, because I think the conversation often misses the point entirely. And the conversation about strict subscription or church autonomy are not to the issue. The issue is, which differences on the application of complementarianism are we willing to tolerate and maintain cooperation? And let's have that. We've been having that discussion, and I think it's been very healthy. And let's make a decision, what differences are we going to tolerate, which ones not?
I'm going to go back to a question I asked before I didn't get an answer to, and this is my final question, and then I think we're going to open it up.
I don't think so, given the time.
Not.
I think we're just, yeah.
Okay. This is not congregational.
There are various ways of ascertaining the will of the congregation.
Sometimes the bishop speaks, right? Amen? So I, in my suggested at the breakdown in theological consensus. You had some interesting marks privately about where you thought maybe that's not the case, but here's my final question. Isn't there a breakdown in theological consensus, and isn't it inevitable that we increase the standard of subscription in years to come? As culture does this in some respects, not all, but in many respects does this, doesn't it become more important for churches to say, well, yes, we believe this, and we're going to hold on to that? So I want to hear from each of you on that or not. Mark.
Yeah, I want to agree with what Greg was saying earlier. That can't be the whole answer, maybe not even the main answer. But do I think that's a good general characterization? Yes.
Greg.
So because for a lot of reasons, yes, I think we can expect consensus to break down, and maybe that's been true always in some measure. And the main ways to address that are through the teaching of the word, the preaching ministry, discipleship, even theological education is incredibly important to that. And confessions are very important to that. I don't think there's always been as tight a consensus as we sometimes look back and think. It's been different issues though, but I do think we're going to continue to face this issue in our culture today.
Yeah. Travis?
Yeah, I think there is an issue with a greater lack of theological consensus. I'm not sure that it's because of theological issues in so much as it's a concern of missiological pragmatism. Let's worry less about theological consensus and more about evangelism. I'm not at all knocking evangelism or discipleship in any way, shape, or form. But if we're going to come together to do evangelism, missions, and discipleship, theological education, we have to agree on theological essentials. If we have pragmatism over and above theological unity, all we'll have is a mess, which is the academic term.
Travis, are there other like super associations like yours out there? Are these morphing and becoming? Are there more of these mutant forms out there of association?
I would like to say we're unique, but there are other associations that are becoming much stronger. And I would encourage every one of you brothers to get your churches involved in your local association. Find your identity first and foremost in Christ. Find it secondly in your local church. Thirdly, find it in your local association. Don't find it primarily in the Southern Baptist Convention or your state convention. Get involved locally where you can sit down with pastors in your zip code, in your county, in your city, look across the table from them face to face, talk to them. Let iron sharpen iron locally. If we spent as much time on local associations as we have on just the law amendment, the entire convention would change overnight.
Pillar?
Yeah, I mean, I just think increasingly, particularly in a postmodern world, I think having confessions help us. I can't imagine, this is probably what I come back to, I can't imagine if we were forming the Southern Baptist Convention today, we would not have a statement of faith that meant a whole lot about our cooperation. And so if that would be the case for us starting today, I can't imagine a world in which we're not going to become at least more confessional, not necessarily strict, but it would be looser at the larger level than it would be at the local level. But I can't imagine a world in which we would start something like this today and the confession of faith not be front and center in what we're starting.
Brothers, thanks for your time. Any final announcements, Mark?
Yeah, there are a lot of examples in Baptist life right now of this more maximal cooperation. You look at Pillar Network, stop by their booth. There's the ACME, Association of Churches for Missions and Evangelism. ACME, you can check them out, where they have 8 characteristics they want agreed upon by churches that are participating.